Thank you. And thank you for all those of you who are attending in person, and for those of you who are attending online, thank you for tuning in. I guess I should acknowledge here, since everybody's here today, all of my co-authors are actually in the audience. Amanda Dillon, who now works for New York State DEC, is here, and she just introduced Neil and Alex are all here. So these all these people contributed to this work in various ways. Okay, what? Sure. Well, no, it might make me dark on the screen. We should leave it on. As some of you may already be aware, back in 2019, it was newsworthy. Hold on, there we go. Right, scientists raised some alarming concerns about bird populations in North America. Using multiple standardized monitoring data sets and a network of weather radar, they documented a greater than 30% decline in bird populations over the last 50 years. So that equates to a loss of 3 billion birds since the 1970s. And those population losses occurred over most species groups. Although not examined as a distinct group, shrubland birds, it wasn't examined as a distinct group in their analysis, but shrubland birds are also a group of birds that's showing troubling declines nationally. So here are just some of the nationwide trends for shrubland bird species. This is from the North American breeding bird survey data. You can see that all these trends are heading in the wrong direction. Even birds like field sparrows and eastern towhees, which I tend to think is pretty common, are declining, which is worrisome. So, and then in the Northeast, shrubland birds are about 15% of the breeding bird species in the region. So given that many of these species in this group are declining, this is a group that deserves a high level of attention with regards to conservation actions. Now, conservation efforts for shrubland birds tend to focus a lot on early successional forests. For those of you who don't know what that is, early successional forests are just, they can include forests that are growing back after a timber harvest or following some other form of disturbance, such as wind throw or ice damage or insect attacks. Those forests that grow back after that are considered early successional forests. They can also include fields. Once they become abandoned, the forests move into those areas. Those are also fall under this idea of early successional forests. And in the lower picture here with the old field succession, right, that happened a lot when the farmlands were abandoned in the eastern seaboard and everybody moved west to farm. All those farmlands got abandoned, and all that turned into early successional forest temporarily, and then eventually matured into forest. And the focus on early successional forest for these group of shrubland birds is justified, as the declines in the shrubland birds have closely followed the declines in these young successional forests. So for example, if this shows the trends in young forests, so these are forests that are in the seedling and sapling stages. And so this map shows the percent changes in the areas of these young forests in these seedling sapling stages in 31 states that are within the eastern region of the North American Breeding Bird Survey. And you can see most of those are sort of shaded red, right? They're all sort of tending in the negative direction. Greater than about 3/4 of those states are trending negative, and on average, they're about a 3% decline in early successional forests. But it's important to note that yes, early successional forests get a lot of attention, but they're not the only habitat for these species. Pine barrens are often overlooked in the conversation about declining shrubland birds. So these are areas with open canopies. They have a shrub layer, they have grassy openings. They provide critical habitat for these species as well. So this slide shows the distribution of the pine barrens in the Northeast. So, but in this presentation, I'm going to share with you what we're doing to benefit the suite of shrubland bird species here in the Albany Pine Bush. I can get that. No, that's probably me. There we go. Thank you. So I'm going to share with you what we're doing to benefit the suite of shrubland birds here in the Albany Pine Bush. These are pine barrens here in eastern New York. But before I get to the birds, I wanted to tell you a little bit, give you a brief overview of what is the Albany Pine Bush and explain to you some of the work that we're doing here to restore and maintain the pine barrens. So we'll start with what is the Albany Pine Bush? Well, the Albany Pine Bush is just a local name for an ecosystem known as the Northeastern Interior Pine Barrens. At its base, it's a field of parabolic sand dunes. So here you can see a topographic map of the sand dunes. You can see that they're all windblown into these parabolic shapes. If we remove the vegetation down there, shows you what it looks like when the vegetation removes. It looks like just like the blowing sand dunes of the Sahara Desert. The plants that historically occurred here had to be adapted to these dry, sandy, infertile, acidic soils, and they had to be able to survive periodic fire. So these plants included pitch pine, scrub oak, heath, grasses, and forbs. And with regular disturbance from fire, they assemble themselves into these very open vegetation structures that you see here. And the ecosystem is far from homogeneous. There are different ecological communities that make up the ecosystem. There are successional northern sandplain grasslands. So these are predominantly grasslands with very little shrub and tree cover. There are pitch pine scrub oak barrens. These have scattered pitch pines in the canopy and patches of scrub oak and heath and grasses in the understory. There are pitch pine scrub oak thickets. These are very similar to the scrub oak barrens, except for they have a much higher component of scrub oak, and there's less grassy openings within those. And then we have the pitch pine oak forest. This is essentially a closed canopy forest of pitch pine. It does have some scrub oak in the shrub layer, but otherwise very little herbaceous in the understory. And these communities can be considered successional variants of each other, meaning that these communities can transition from one to the other depending on the intensity and frequency of their disturbances. So for example, if fire is infrequent, say in the barrens, those scrub oaks or those pitch pines can become dominant and convert the barrens into a thicket or a pitch pine oak forest. On the other hand, if fires are intense and frequent enough, it can pretty much turn any of those into successional northern sampling grassland. So we consider some combination of these four communities sort of to be representative of the historic vegetation conditions of the pine bush. So it's these communities, and especially the pitch pine scrub oak barrens, that are our main conservation priorities. Now, there are other ecological communities out there. There's pine barrens, vernal ponds, red maple hardwood swamps, shallow emergent marshes. These are all communities we also want to conserve. They were here historically because they were historically part of the landscape because fire was naturally excluded from these areas, right? They were really wet, so they wouldn't burn, and so they sort of existed. However, we also have other communities such as Appalachian oak pine forest, successional northern hardwood forest, and successional southern hardwood forest. These are communities that were unlikely to have occurred here historically. We have them here now because invasive species were introduced, because we've had decades of fire suppression that allowed some of these native species to become overabundant and turn these barrens into forests that you can see here. So these are communities that we do not want, and I'll come back to how we're dealing with some of these in a little bit. Okay, so now you know what the pine bush is. Now let's address why it's important. Why are we trying to restore it? Why do we care about it? What makes it special? Well, two of the communities I just mentioned are globally rare. One of those is the pitch pine scrub oak barrens. The New York Natural Heritage Programs gives these a G2 S1 rating. The G2 means there's less than 20 occurrences of this community in the world. The S1 means there's less than 5 occurrences of this community type in the state. And the Albany Pine Bush is considered one of the best remaining examples of this community remaining in the world. Now, we also have Pine Barrens Vernal Pond. This is sort of, by definition, rare because pine barrens are rares, and these guys are embedded within pine barrens. New York Natural Heritage Programs gives them a G3, G4, S2 rating. So slightly less rare, but still rare. Now, not surprisingly, the unique plant communities of the pine bush supports a unique assemblage of animals that are really quite distinct from the surrounding forest, which here in the Northeast is primarily these eastern deciduous forests. And many of the animals that occur here are of conservation concern. For example, we have greater than 80 wildlife species of greatest conservation need. Many of them are birds, but there you can see some of the other ones. And here are just some of the examples. So the one we're sort of most famously known for is the Karner blue butterfly, but we also have the eastern spadefoot toad, brown thrasher, inland barrens buck moth. There's prairie warbler down there, and eastern hognose snake. So the importance of the Albany pine bush has also been formally recognized. The National Park Service has recognized us as a national natural landmark due to our rare ecology and geology. It's also been designated as a New York State bird conservation area by the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. And we've been designated an important bird area by the National Audubon Society. And it's also received other designations, again, for its unique ecology, geology, and the history of this place. Now, I said before that the Albany pine bush and its constituents communities are globally rare. Well, why is that? Well, pine barrens and ecosystems in general are rare because they usually take some very special conditions to develop. The Albany pine bush owes its origins to its sandy soils, which are really distinct from the surrounding soils. If you get outside of the Albany pine bush area, you get very different soils. So how did that sand get here? Well, the sand got here due to it's basically post-glacial sand deposits that were deposited in the bottom of Glacial Lake Albany, which flooded much of the Hudson Valley. Eventually, that lake drained and exposed all those sandy deposits on the bottom of the lake. Down here in the Albany area, those sand blew around and formed dunes until eventually vegetation that was adapted to those sand dunes encroached into those areas and covered the dunes. Now, on top of its already limited distribution globally, the area of the Albany pine bush has been further reduced and degraded by threats acting locally. Habitat loss has been the biggest threat to the pine bush. Right? Due to the human development, the ecosystem has been reduced from about 10,000 hectares. Now there's less than 3,000 hectares that have been considered intact or restorable. Here are just a couple of local examples of habitat loss that you may be familiar with. Does anybody know what this top one is? Cross gauge. What about down here? Yep, University of Albany. All right, built on what was formerly pine bush. The second biggest threat has been habitat degradation, which in part has come from fire suppression. Fire would historically burn in these areas and keep them open. However, starting about 50 to 100 years ago, any fires that started were actively suppressed. That allowed shrubs and trees to become dominant. They became established at high densities, and they turned the barrens into thickets, and they turned them into forest. Habitat degradation has also occurred through species invasions, and here we're talking about invasive plants. These species move in, they displace the native species, and they change the ecosystem properties. So for example, here on the upper one, here's Asiatic bittersweet that's sort of taking over the understory and shading out all the natives. Down below is black locust. Once it gets established, it forms these clonal stands and creates closed canopy forest, which is, again, very far from being barrens. Okay, so now let's turn our attention to the preserve itself. The Albany Pine Bush Preserve was established by an act of legislation in 1988 to protect the remnants of this ecosystem, the pine barrens ecosystem, and the globally rare pitch pine scrub oak barrens within it. Looking at the preserve should make it very clear that we're dealing with a very urban preserve here. 90 cuts right through the middle of the preserve. 87 cuts through one end. We have the landfill, we have shopping malls, we have golf courses, we got railroad tracks, power lines, residential and commercial development all around and in between pieces of the preserve. And so, as I mentioned before, much of the pine bush has been destroyed, and as you can see, what remains is highly fragmented. So that's a little bit about the ecosystem, background of the ecosystem. Now I want to just briefly go into what we're doing to restore the ecosystem. So one of the most important things we can do to restore the ecosystem is to increase its size. If we are trying to get species to return to and persist in this ecosystem, then we need to have suitable pine barrens in areas large enough to support viable populations of the plants and animals that occur here. So to this end, we're slowly acquiring more land to add to the preserve. When the preserve was established in 1988, it was only about 800 hectares. We've since grown that size to about 1,300 hectares. We're hoping to add another, hopefully 1,200 hectares and get us up to somewhere in the range of about 2,500 hectares. And importantly, when we're trying to piece together the preserve, we're trying to connect areas of the preserve. We're trying to reduce fragmentation, increase continuity among the different pieces of the preserve. I should also note that a lot of the land that's currently in the preserve, and certainly pretty much all the land that we're adding to the preserve, is not high quality pine barrens. Again, it tends to be highly degraded by decades of fire suppression and invasive species. So a lot of what we do here is dealing with habitat degradation caused by these by the lack of fire and by this invasion of non-native plants. So we deal with habitat degradation through habitat management. Some of our most drastic habitat management is to deal with black locust. This is one of our worst invasive species. This is a tree that's native to the southeastern US. It was introduced up here to use for fence posts, firewood, and erosion control. But once it becomes established, it can turn an area into a closed canopy forest like you can see here. And so these areas are completely altered from the historical conditions. These are really no longer providing habitat for many pine barrens species. So we decided the best way to deal with black locusts is just to completely remove them. So we cut them down, we remove the logs. If there's any pitch pine or oak sort of hanging on within the canopy of the black locust, we keep those. But otherwise, we cut down the black locust, we remove the logs, we rip up the stumps, and we bury the stumps underground because we don't want them resprouting. And then we're essentially starting from scratch. We're right back down to the sand. So we come in and we replant these areas with native species. And then hopefully after a few years of growth, we get something like this. So this work takes the community from what was a successional southern hardwood forest, and it becomes a successional northern sandplain grassland. Now, this isn't pitch pine scrub oak barrens, but at least now we're on that continuum. So with some additional time or with some planting of some scrub oak or other woody shrubs, these will eventually become barrens. So this shows you our map, shows you our progress so far in removing black locust. You can see what we've removed here represents just a little over half of the black locust that currently exists within the preserve. Another tree species we were trying to remove is aspen. This is actually a native species, but it does occur in this area naturally. But the issue here is that due to fire suppression, this species has sort of taken over. Normally, fire would have excluded this species. So this species, the absence of fire has allowed this species to become widely established. So to remove aspen, we're using a method known as drill and fill. So we go and we drill holes into the aspen, and then we'd inject herbicide into the aspen, and that would kill the aspen without causing it to resprout. If you just cut the aspen down, all those roots would send up sprouts, and you have a ton of aspen. So we injected the herbicide in, it kills the aspen standing. And this is what we're left with. So we have a bunch of standing dead aspen. Aspen don't last very long. We can either go in and cut those down, or in about 5 years, this wood rots pretty quick. That'll probably fall down on its own. But the important difference here between this and the black locust is that the canopy of the aspen is relatively open. So there was a lot of native pine barren species that were still in the understory of that aspen forest. So by just by killing the aspen, we've released the understory. So now when we go in and when we've done this work, we're essentially taking what was a successional northern hardwood forest, and once those aspen die out and fall down, we're left with underneath, which is pretty close to a pitch pine scrub oak barrens. Right, because we're releasing those aspens were sort of overshading that a little bit, but we sort of released them from the competition of the aspen that was shading them out. And so the pitch pine scrub oak barrens vegetation rebounds after we remove those aspen. And so this shows you the footprint of that work. So most of this work was between 2005 and 2014. And you can see that we've removed quite a bit of aspen in the preserve, almost 500 hectares. Okay, well, habitat management does not end with just restoring the ecosystem. We also need to reintroduce the processes that are going to maintain the ecosystem once it's restored. So in this case, the primary process that maintains the ecosystem is fire, and we reintroduce fire through prescribed burning. So we try to burn as much as we can each year, but we can really only, because we're in a very urban area, we can only burn under very specific conditions, right? So obviously we can't burn if it's too wet or too humid because the fire's not going to carry. But we also can't burn if it's too dry because the risk of escape is too high. Also, the winds need to be blowing in the right direction at the right speed, right? We can't have smoke from our fires blowing across the thruway. We can't have it blowing into businesses or pouring into people's yards. So we try to burn as much as we can in each year. No. So we try to burn as much as we can in each year, but the reality is we don't burn as much as we'd like to, because it's really hard for us to get the right conditions when we're trying to burn a particular part of the preserve. Now, fire can be used as a restoration tool. For example, if we burn pitch pine oak forest frequently enough and in a high enough intensity, we could potentially turn that into pitch pine scrub oak barrens, but we mostly use fire as a maintenance tool. So once we get either successional northern sandplain grasslands or pitch pine scrub oak barrens, we use fire to maintain those conditions. And so, for example, for successional northern sandplain grasslands, we'd probably want to get out there and burn every 1 to 2 years if we want to keep the woody vegetation out of those areas. For pitch pine scrub oak barrens, probably we need to get in there every 3 to 5 years if we want to try to keep the scrub oak from becoming overabundant or the pitch pines becoming dominant. And this shows you our footprint of the prescribed burns. So these are areas that have been burned 1 or more times since 1991. The graph there just shows you the amount of area that we've burned in each year. And that variation from the year-to-year variation is largely just due, those are the conditions we're presented with. When years that we've been able to burn more, typically we've had better conditions. Years that we burn less, typically there weren't great conditions for burning. Now showing just a footprint of burning isn't it sort of obscures the heterogeneity that the burns are introducing within the landscape. So here's a GIF or a GIF, depending on how you like to say it. Here is a GIF showing you the areas that we burned starting in 1991, and you can see these areas moving around. As these different areas are burned, they recover relatively quickly. Within weeks, they green up, and within months to a few years, they sort of get back to their previous conditions. So over time, the result is a mosaic of vegetation that's in various stages of regeneration following burns. And as we continue to burn, this mosaic continues to shift over time. And this mosaic is important because it allows pine barrens, plants, and animal species that have different habitat requirements. For example, some might like it more grassy, maybe some like it more shrubby. It allows these species with different habitat requirements to persist in the landscape simultaneously because we have all these different ages of regeneration. Okay, so that was a short introduction about the ecosystem and the management that we're doing here to restore the ecosystem and to maintain it. But you guys came to listen about birds, so we were interested in seeing how is all that work that we're doing, how is that affecting the bird community? And we're examining the response in several ways, right? We're looking at the community level, and we're interested in looking at what are the changes in distribution abundance of the birds, and we're doing that using point counts. We're also interested in looking at the survival and reproduction of the birds here, and we're using that following protocols from a program known as Monitoring Avian Productivity and Survivorship. And then we're also looking at individual species. We've looked at survival and territory fidelity of the prairie warbler. And we're also looked at the habitat use of the eastern whippoorwill and the eastern towhee. So these studies are in various stages of completion. Some of them are going to have more finalized analyses. Some of them will still be preliminary results. And also in the time I have, I can only sort of briefly hit on some of these studies. So you'll just be sort of getting a sample of results from these. Now, before I get into individual bird studies, I wanted to mention that we are not directly managing bird populations, right? We are managing vegetation, and then the bird populations are responding to the vegetation. So it's important that we understand and quantify the changes to the vegetation because these changes are what's mediating the birds' responses. So we're monitoring vegetation through something called supervised land cover classification, which is just you translate these aerial images into land cover types. So we've had a few of these done over the years, sort of patch some of these together, and you'll be seeing some of these. I'll be including some of these classifications and some of the results mostly as illustrations, but we sort of come to the realization recently that we need to sort of beef up these analyses. And so we've recently contracted with the New York Natural Heritage Program. They're going to be providing land cover data for all of these years, and they're going to be using a standardized classification system across all of those years. So will hopefully allow us to get a pretty good idea of how these land covers are changing. So once we get those land cover maps in hand, we'll be able to examine changes in land cover composition over time, and then we're going to be able to incorporate that land cover data into the analysis of the bird responses. Okay, now as I mentioned, one of the primary ways we're monitoring bird communities is using point count methodology. So we have points established over along either the current trail system or former trails within the preserve. And so that's what those points on that map are. So we started with 57 points in 2012. In 2020, we backed that down to 44 points. And a single survey consists of us visiting all these points within a single morning between sunrise and 11 a.m. That's considered one survey. And for each of those surveys, we go out to one of those points and we stand there and we count and we record all the birds that we either see or hear within a 10-meter period. And then we record which distance class they're in, we record the time of the observation, we record behavioral observations. For example, was it a singing male? Was it a juvenile? Was it a female? And typically we conduct anywhere between 1 and 8 surveys per year. These are weather dependent. On average, we get about 5 per year. And these are all breeding season surveys. So we're pretty much doing this through the month of June and sometimes occasionally into early July. And for analysis for these guys, we're interested in limiting it to 50 meters, and we excluded flyovers, right? We don't want to be counting birds that are 300 meters away, right? We're interested in what's happening at that point where we're surveying, and so we limited the observations to 50 meters, and we are excluding flyovers because those birds, who knows where they're going? They might not be using the anything around where the point where we're surveying. Okay, so this graph shows the number of species we've observed in each year. The reason why I'm showing you is this is obviously we've conducted different numbers of surveys in each year, and the more surveys you conduct, the more likely you are to the more species you're likely to see. So rather than just me presenting a total number of species, I'm presenting this as a species accumulation curve, so you can compare among the years because they had different surveys. And so what I want you to notice here is if you look at the early years here, the lighter colors, and pretty much with the exception of 2024, the number of species have declined over time. That sounds bad. Well, why is that? Why are the number of species declining? Well, if we look here at the proportion of points where we detected forest birds, notice what's happening in the forest birds. The forest birds are disappearing out of the landscape, right? We're removing the forest, we're converting it to barrens. The forest birds are disappearing. So this includes, if you're not familiar with the four-letter codes, hermit thrush, ovenbirds, red-eyed vireos, scarlet tanagers, veeries, and wood thrushes. These are all declining in the landscape because we're cutting down the forest and converting it to barrens. Now we can see these shifts in bird communities more clearly if let's look at an individual point where the forest was removed. So the way I looked at these shifts in communities, I used a method known as non-metric multidimensional scaling. This is an ordination technique that just you're separating the sites in space. And so these dots represent sites, and sites that are, the way this ordination works is sites that are more similar in species composition will be closer together in space, and sites that are less similar to each other in species composition will be farther from each other in space, in ordination space. So in this case, I ordinated the same point over time. So each point represents the same site at a different year. So the blue points there represent, those are the years that we surveyed those points before the trees were cut. The green points represent those sites in the years that we after we removed the trees. And so you can see we have a pretty clear separation here of those before and after the trees were removed. And all the arrows and those codes on there, those are the species so the direction in the air, the length and the direction of the arrows kind of shows you how those species are loading up on those different sites. And so you can see here, I have a pointer. Yeah, so you can see here over in blue, you can see we got things like scarlet tanager, wood thrush, ovenbird, veery, red-eyed vireo. Those are sort of loading up on those points prior to the tree removal. And if we look over here, you can see now where we see species like eastern towhee, field sparrow, common yellowthroat, prairie warbler, Baltimore oriole, indigo bunting. Those are now occurring at those sites after the trees were removed. So we have this sort of very clear separation. So just to show you that wasn't just a fluke at that point, here's another point where we remove the forest. You can see again, we have a very clear separation. Those similar groups of species are sort of separating. And here's just two more points where we had a point, there was forest before, we removed the forest, and here are the communities afterwards. So we've seen a sort of a very clear separation. The communities shifted from predominantly forest bird species to ones that are now dominated by these shrubland bird species. Now, the next steps for these data are to come up with density estimates for each species. So we'll use that point count data to come up with densities for each species. We're going to base those pretty much on the number of males, territorial males. And we do that because the males are the ones singing. Those are the ones that are easy to count. And so, you know, if you really wanted to try to get a true density, you could take the number of males and double it by females. That assumes that every male is paired. But we pretty much are basing this on the number of territorial males. And we get at that because the males are there, the males are singing. And so the densities will ultimately be just the number of males per hectare. And I'm going to incorporate vegetation information from each point as a covariate. So the idea here is to try to obtain estimates for different vegetation types. For example, if we were looking at a prairie warbler, it's going to have a very different density in a barrens as opposed to if we're sampling a point of the forest. So we want to be able to account for those differences. So by incorporating the vegetation information, once we get these land cover maps, then I will be able to calculate different density estimates for these different vegetation types for each species. And then we can use those density estimates with these land cover maps, and then we should be able to come up with a population size estimate for each species in the preserve in each year. And then once we have those population sizes in any given year, then we can track those changes in population sizes over time. So given all the restoration work we're doing, we're changing a lot of these forests into barrens. So we expect to see an increase in the abundance of shrubland birds and a decrease in abundance of these forest birds. So fingers crossed, we'll see if the data actually upholds those expectations, but this is sort of where we're going with this analysis. And once we get these land cover types, I can start to move forward with these analysis, but this is sort of where we're headed. Okay, so just having the right bird species here. So that's great. Those birds are here, right? That's not enough. What happens if these birds show up? They're here, they're singing, we hear them, but what happens if they fail to survive? What happens if they die once they get here? What happens if they fail to successfully reproduce? Right, we want to make sure we're creating habits that are a source of new individuals, that these individuals are showing up, they're reproducing, and they're making more young that will come back to the site in future years or go and populate other sites. So we don't want to be a sink where these individuals just show up and they basically die or don't reproduce. So to determine this, we need to look at the survival and productivity of the birds here in the preserve. And we're doing this following the protocol of a program known as Monitoring Avian Productivity and Survivorship Program. This is organized by the Institute for Bird Populations, and these green dots here. So we're one of many stations of many participating locations across North America. So following their protocols, we capture birds. We put bands on them to uniquely identify them. We identify them to species. We use feather characteristics to age the birds, and we also then assess the sex of the birds. And then from these data, we can estimate survival and reproduction, and that will allow us to get at the quality of the habitat. Are we a source habitat, or are we a sink habitat? So we've run 2 map stations in some of our highest quality pitch pine scrub oak barrens. The station in Carter Barrens West, we ran from 2013 to 2019, and the Truex Trail Barrens when we started running in 2013, and we continue to run that station. So each of these stations consists of 12 nets. They're run for 7 days a year between the end of May and the beginning of August. On average, we have these nets open for about 6 hours per day. And the mean here is that we have almost 6,000 net meter hours. That's just a way for us to measure effort. So it says how many nets do we have up, how long are those nets, and how many hours are those running. So it gives us just an estimate of our survey efforts. So this graph is just to give you an overview of what we've captured. So this represents all the data for both sites combined. So we've had over 5,500 captures. That represents 4,600 approximately unique individuals from 67 species. And so these bars show you the distribution of those species. The ones in red are the shrubland bird species. So you can see that our most commonly caught bird species are gray catbird, American robin, and Baltimore oriole. But you can see a lot of the species, a lot of these shrubland bird species we have here, they're quite prevalent in the preserve. So that includes field sparrow, common yellowthroat, song sparrow, prairie warbler, goldfinch, house wren, eastern towhee, northern mockingbird, eastern bluebird. Right, these are all shrubland birds that that this place calls home, that we have here. Here are graphs of the number of species and the number of individuals we captured at Truex Trail Barren. So this blue line represents all species. The green line is just for those shrubland bird species. And I wasn't exactly sure how to represent this. So next to this, here's another animated GIF for GIF showing this is fire this is the fire that was occurring during these years that we were banding out there. So this shows you where these areas were burned while we were banding. Right, and for me, the takeaway from this is that all that burning was going on over these years, and yeah, we saw some fluctuations, but it's not like these populations crashed out when we were managing these areas. Right? You guys have probably driven by and seen some of the burns. They look bad at first. Everything looks black, but they're very ephemeral, right? The vegetation comes back very quickly and the birds come back very quickly too. And so despite all this management that we're doing, you can see that these birds are persisting in the landscape despite all the management. Except for 2021. I wasn't sure what's going on 2021. Things got a little low, but there wasn't any even particular management right around the preserve. the time. So, but generally they persist in the landscape even with all of the management that we're doing. Okay, so this graph shows the proportion of birds captured that were juvenile over the course of the breeding season. So each of these lines is for a different year. So early on in the breeding season, you can see we're not catching very many birds. That's not surprising because they haven't been hatched out yet. Some of them probably haven't even been laid yet. But as we continue over the course of the breeding season, you can see the proportion of hatch here, those proportion of juvenile birds increases. And that's for all bird species, but you can see we see the same trend for those shrubland bird species that we're interested in. And so for the fact that we're catching by the end of the season, most of the birds we're catching are these juvenile birds. So based on the degree to which the young birds are outnumbering the adult birds at the end of the breeding season, we can be pretty confident that we're providing good breeding habitat for these because we're just loaded with young birds at the end of each breeding season. Okay, the next step for these data then are to use the encounter histories with individuals that we've recaptured. So there's just some of the data. So you can see that top line there, for example, is an American robin female. We captured her in 2018. We captured her again in 2019, again in 2021. So we can use this encounter histories of these individuals to estimate survival, right? We can do this to estimate survival of juvenile adults. Hopefully we will be able to use the ratios of second year to adult after second year birds. So basically the returning juvenile birds to the adult birds, we can hopefully use that as an estimate of productivity. And then we can use those survival estimates and productivity estimates to parameterize a population model and hopefully get rates of population growth. Maybe, we'll see. So Dylan's looking at me hopeful. So this is the plan where we're going for this. And so hopefully we'll be able to get rates of population change for some of these species, right? Some of these species we didn't capture enough of them to do that, but for the species that we've captured enough individuals of, and we have enough of these encounter histories for, we should be able to get estimates of survival and productivity. And then hopefully we can calculate this rate of population change. And that'll tell us as the populations, are they increasing? Are they stable? Are they decreasing here in the preserve? Okay, now I mentioned that before that one of the species we focus on was prairie warblers, and the reason why we focus on that is some of our previous research here at the preserve said that these guys are indicators of high-quality pitch-pine scrub oak barrens. So we were interested in how prairie warblers are faring in the preserve in terms of their survival and territory fidelity. Right, the idea here is if prairie warblers are doing well, then hopefully other species that are dependent upon the barrens are also doing well. So in terms of field methods for these guys, we capture prairie warblers. We put color bands on them, as you can see in the picture. That allowed us to uniquely identify these individuals, right? We didn't have to capture them. We can use our binoculars to recapture them because we could see the color bands and we can know which individual we're looking at. And then we track those birds over time, and every time we were able to locate a bird, we plot a location on a map. And so we could use those encounter histories that we constructed from those birds. I used a hierarchical Jolly Seabird model. Basically, it allowed me to get survival estimates for these male birds. And then we took those location estimates, or those locations that we plotted for those birds, and we can plot them on a map, and then we could use a 95% convex, a minimum convex polygon for birds that had greater than 5 observations to sort of get an idea this is where their territory was. And then if these birds return from one year to the next, we could look at how close they put their territory in 1 year from the next. And we did that by measuring the distance between the territory centroids. So we found the prairie warblers actually tend to look like they have a pretty high survival in, I was kind of surprised. It was about 70% from 2009 to 2011. It was about 70% survival. It dipped down a little bit in 2012, but 70% of these guys surviving is pretty good. Let's not forget these guys are going all the way down to the Caribbean, and they're coming all the way back every year, and they're coming back. They're doing a pretty good job at surviving that trek and coming back every year. We also found that they have pretty high territory fidelity. For example, this here shows the shifts in territories from 2009 to 2010. So the average here, if we look at all these individuals, the shifts, they were about 284 meters was the average. But that includes 2 of these individuals that I'm not exactly sure. I don't think it was necessarily related to management. For whatever reason, 2 individuals shifted from different parts of the preserve. But if we take those individuals out and we just look at just those individuals down here, these birds only moved an average of about 50 meters between years. So again, these guys are going all the way to the Caribbean, coming all the way back, and they're putting their territories almost in the exact same place that they were the year before. So I would say that the fact that these guys have high survival and they're coming back and using the same areas pretty much over and over, that suggests that we're providing pretty good habitat for them. Otherwise, these birds typically, if they fail, have a failed nesting event, they pretty much will go try somewhere else. They're not going to keep coming back if they're not having success. Eastern whippoorwills are another individual species that we looked at. We were interested in this one because this species used to be quite common in the preserve, in the pine bush. But in the last 50 years, they largely disappeared. And that's because the barrens, again, we neglected the barrens. They weren't burned. Invasive species moved in. The barrens turned to forest. The whippoorwills don't like forest, so they disappeared. Well, but since we started doing all this management, in response to our management, it looks like the species may be making a return to the pine barrens. And so for the last few years, we've noticed, thanks to our community scientists who will actually go out and help count our whippoorwills, we've noticed that we've have singing males now returning to the preserve. And we're hopeful that these few individuals that seem to be coming back every year are the start of a population becoming reestablished in the preserve. So as these birds come back, we're interested in their habitat use. So we're gathering this information using archival GPS tags. So these are tags that we put on. So there you can see a tag with a harness that we've attached. And we deploy these tags for about 2 to 3 weeks, and we do these between May and June because we have to get them while they're defending territories and defending mates, because we need to put these tags on and then we need to recapture them to get them off. The way you get them in the net is by playing a territorial male call, and if they're not really interested, if they're not feeling aggressive, they don't respond. So we need to get them during the breeding season when they're going to respond to our territorial playbacks. So these tags are they can hold for about 60 observations on the tags, and they're pre-programmed. Neil programs the tags, take them observations at certain times. And like I said before, we then have to go out and recapture these birds to get the tags off the birds, and then we download the data. So here's the location data from 6 birds that we've captured between 2009 and 2025. One bird was actually been very cooperative. The one here in different shades of blue. This bird was caught 4 times. So we've caught it from 2022 to 2025. Every year we've been able to catch it, and it keeps coming back to the same place. Now you might also be wondering, like, what's going on with this orange bird? So we think this probably has to do with the breeding status of these birds. We think probably these birds here that have very small territories, these probably were able to secure a mate. So they were probably holding their territory, defending their mate, where this orange guy probably did not. So he was probably flying far and wide looking for a mate. Poor guy. So if we remove that lovelorn individual from the map, we can just focus in on these other ones. We can get a closer look at the territories of these birds, and we can see that just from the aerial imagery, we can see that these birds are using a mix of forest and openings. So as an example, we can take a closer look at just one of these individuals. So here are the locations for one individual plotted on a map of the land cover types. So I was just interested in sort of to see how they're using this. What I did is I dichotomized all those different land cover types into just basically forest and open. Was it an open barren type of habitat, grassland habitat, rubus, or was it a forested habitat? And so I dichotomized the landscape into forest and open. And then here we have the black points represent the points that were programmed to take readings at night. And then the white ones were programmed to take readings during the day. And then I was interested in what are the characteristics happening around those points. So I put 50-meter buffers around all those points. And then we can look and we can see during the day, they're roosting, right? They're nocturnal birds. And so during the day, they're primarily roosting in more forested areas. And then when they're out at night, when they're active, when they're singing and they're feeding, they're using a mix of forest and open areas. So this is just one bird. Once I get the land cover data for more birds, I'll be able to do a similar analysis for all these birds. But again, this is just to illustrate how they're using our habitat, and how by converting forest to barrens, we're sort of these birds are reappearing and recolonizing the preserve. We've also tracked the habitat use of eastern towhees. And so with this, we've tagged these birds with these life tags. So you'll notice here, there's a little solar panel on these tags. And so these tags are nice because once we put them on, we don't have to recapture the birds to get the information. They're actively transmitting information into this those white dots on the map there are part of our node network. So we capture the birds, put these tags on them, and release them into that node network. And those node networks are sort of mini base stations. They have solar panels, they have a battery, they have a receiver, and an antenna that collects the information. So all these things are constantly feeding information into each of these different nodes. Those nodes then are relay information up to our MODIS station, which is on the top of the Discovery Center. And then these data, we can download the data and from the MODIS network, and we can post-process the data and localize the tags within this node network. So in 2021, we tagged 10 birds. Here are the data from just one 3-day interval. So I don't know if you've ever tracked birds before. This is sort of like an embarrassment of riches in terms of how many points we get for these birds in just a 3-day period. Old school, if you're doing this with handheld telemetry, you're probably likely if you get like a half a dozen observations. And so here you can see we have the hundreds in just a 3-day interval. And so now what you're going to see is like those points in 3-day intervals over about a 3-week period. So you can see where those birds are, how those birds are moving around out there in the node network. And here you can see a little easier. This is just a kernel home range density estimate that shows you the outline of their territories. And you can see there is a lot of overlap in the territories, which was quite surprising to us. We always thought they would be defending their territories and keeping the males out. There was a lot of overlap here. So we sort of took that as to suggest that these are probably pretty high quality habitat if we can pack this many individuals into such into one area. And just to be clear, right, it's not that there aren't eastern towhees over here. We just weren't able to capture these and get tags on them. So this is just showing you the birds that we were able to capture. Towhees are notoriously hard to capture. If you can get them in the net, they usually pop right out. They do not stick in the net. And so as Dylan can tell you, she pretty much spearheaded this project. It was a lot of work just to get these 10 individuals. And so just because we don't see the birds over there doesn't mean that their eastern towhees weren't there. This is just to show you where we caught those birds. Okay, then to summarize, we are continuing to manage the Albany Pine Bush in ways that are shifting the ecological communities from forest to pine barrens. And again, we're maintaining those barrens with prescribed fire. And going along with that, we've seen a change in the bird community in response to this work. The forest birds are disappearing from the landscape, and the shrubland bird species are moving into these areas once we restore them to barrens. And in places where we have high quality pitch pine scrub oak barrens, it looks like that these birds are very productive in those areas. So they tend to have high breeding productivity in the pitch pine scrub oak barrens. In terms of some of the individual species, what I showed you looks like we're probably providing pretty good habitat for prairie warblers, eastern whippoorwills, and eastern towhees. The fact that these birds are here and they're returning and that they're occurring in relatively high densities. So as we continue to increase the amount and quality of pine barrens locally, what we're doing is we're hopefully bolstering the population of shrubland birds that are already here. And we're also hopefully increasing, so we're bolstering the populations of birds that are already here, but hopefully we're going to also increasing the suitability of areas for extirpated species. So we're able to attract sort of lure the eastern whippoorwill back because we restored these areas to barrens. Hopefully we're going to see other species sort of make this return on their own too. Things like the golden wing warbler was a species that historically occurred here. Maybe as we continue to manage the habitat, we can increase the suitability of the area for some of these other species. And then with continued management, hopefully we expect the Albany Pine Bush hopefully is going to act as a consistent source of population for shrubland birds in the Northeast. If we have these guys are showing up, if they're producing lots of young, right, some of them will come back here, but some of them will disperse to other areas. So hopefully we're contributing to the conservation here locally and also regionally, and maybe this can help mitigate some of the declines that we're seeing regionally, if not nationally. Now, I wanted to finish just by stepping back a little bit from our patch of pine barrens here in the north, in Albany, and I want to examine how pine barrens fit into the landscape of the Northeast now and into the future. So here's a map again showing the current distribution of pine barrens in the Northeast. Again, you can see that they're rare and they're isolated. Many of the pine barrens throughout the Northeast have sandy soils like we have here at the Albany Pine Bush, but not all of them. Some of them have these bedrock barrens where they have really thin soils. But pretty much all of these have things in common. They're all fire dependent. They all have similar ecological communities, right? They have unproductive soils. You couple that with fire. that constrains the vegetation cover, that promotes open canopies and limits the type of species that can occur there. So a lot of the ecological communities of these different places are similar structurally and floristically. So all of these tend to be dominated by pitch pine or jack pine and tend to have scrub oak or heath in the shrub layer. And these types of ecological communities tend to support unique assemblages of rare and declining birds, insects, and reptiles. So given the importance of these communities for biodiversity conservation, we should really look into protecting, increasing their presence in the region. And for starters, what we can do is improve the regions that we already, improve the areas that we already have protected. So many of these, like the Albany Pine Bush, are not in great shape, right? They've all been neglected, years of excluding fire, invasive species have moved in. So a lot of these places are, like the Albany Pine Bush, are not in great shape. So restoration work is needed in a lot of these barrens to return them to their historical conditions. So I talked to you about the restoration work at the Albany Pine Bush. However, restoration efforts are happening in other places on this post-glacial sand deposits around here. So just north of the Albany Pine Bush, the Schenectady Pine Barrens is restoring pine barrens there. If you go a little farther north to Big Bend Preserve at Moreau Lake State Park, they're also restoring barrens there. And I think most of these other barrens in the Northeast are at least doing some restoration work as well. So the restoration of these protected lands to functioning pine barrens ecosystem is one part of the effort. We should also look beyond this suite of currently protected areas. And so if we look at some of the species that occur in these ecosystems, it seems like these areas were probably much more historically widespread than they're currently represented on that map. So for example, the historical range of the Karner blue, not a bird, I know. The reason why I'm showing the Karner blue is because birds have high dispersal ability. If you create a habitat, they can typically find it. Here we have a Karner blue that typically in its lifetime will only move about 200 meters. So how, if you have something that's so limited in terms of its ability to disperse, how was it able to extend its range all throughout from Maine to Minnesota? Right, there had to have been habitat across that range for these species who have existed across this entire area. So where those areas may have been historically. So to answer this question from New York State, Jeff Corbin from Union College and one of his students modeled the soil conditions that support pine barrens, sand plains, and related ecosystems in New York. So he mapped all the areas in the state with sandy soils. And this map shows the area with sandy soil conditions and their current land cover. So some of those conditions, some of those areas we can probably kiss off because they're covered in urban areas, but some of them have agriculture and forest covered. So those potentially are restorable. So it's hard to see at this scale, but there's these sandy areas that are sprinkled all throughout New York State. And the total area that he found with suitable soil conditions was greater than 9,500 kilometers squared. So that nearly doubled the recognized area of barrens and shrubland and grassland habitat that occurs on deep sandy soils in New York State. So further evidence that these areas were much more widespread comes from the fire record. Historically, fire played a much more prominent role in shaping the ecosystem than the Northeast than I think we typically think about. I think that's changing now. I think as we're getting to understand this, I think we're realizing that fire has played a much more important role historically. So this map shows the fire intervals before 1850. And it was probably indigenous fire stewardship was probably particularly important in maintaining this high frequency of fire regimes. And they probably did this for 7,000 years before European colonization occurred. So under this fire regime, many of those areas that had sandy soils were probably pine barrens. And even areas that weren't necessarily sandy soils under this type of fire regime, they were probably maintained as grasslands or savanna ecosystems. And those also could have functioned as habitat for some of these pine barren species. So I think if you look at the underlying soils and the fire history, I think that sort of offers new possibilities for future conservation and restoration efforts. In areas with these sandy soils, with restoration and application of fire can probably turn these areas back into barrens. And again, this is especially true where those areas are now currently covered with agriculture and fire. Those are probably restorable areas. And right, so we can then, if we can restore those areas, then we can use this to further support not just the shrubland bird diversity, but also just the pine barrens bird diversity or pine barrens biodiversity throughout the Northeast. And again, maybe regionally And depending on how big how much work we can do, it can have a much larger reach than just beyond New York State. It could affect regional populations as well. All right, so that's all I had. I don't know how I'm doing for time. Yeah, not too bad, a little long, but thank you. So I can take questions here. I think Alex will also maybe have some questions for people that are observing online. So if anybody wants to start. Yes.
Were you able to determine whether there was a minimum patch size of habitat that you need in order to draw in your target species? I mean, you're working on pretty large chunks of land.
Yeah, no, I think we've certainly been discussing that. There's some species like what am I thinking of? Some of the grassland sparrows. Like we have grassland patches, but for some of the reasons we're not there aren't apparently big enough to pull in some of those area sensitive species. So we haven't quantified any of that stuff, but certainly some are probably area sensitive, and we might see that change as we open up more areas of some of those species may come back. But no, we haven't looked directly at patch size, but we suspect that that's limiting some species from being able to return to the landscape. Because we were managing for quite a long time, and then all of a sudden they just popped up like, oh yeah, just a few years ago. It was open up enough. Yeah. And so, but there's other species that we should expect here that aren't here yet. And I do wonder if it's a matter of patch size. But yeah, I haven't looked at any of that directly to see, but we expect that that's probably a play for some species. Dylan.
I'm curious with the bird banding data. You see, so you're seeing a change from forest to shrubland in the point count data. How about in what you're catching in the pine barrens? I seem to remember that we would catch some forest birds like late season. So we thought maybe pine barrens were important for post-fledgling dispersal for those forest birds, but are you seeing a decline in the forest species caught at the map stations?
I haven't looked at that. We don't catch. I mean, I think we maybe see that just in the number of captures, but in terms of trying to estimate, they're not going to have any sort of serious encounter histories of those birds. We might catch them randomly, but we're not going to, in terms of if you're trying to look at anything sort of survival based, no. But like we could just look at just the raw numbers. But you know as well as I do that you can, the nets are tricky some days if they happen to fly in. If they don't, it's like one of those things. It's like we're probably not going to have enough data on that to sort of look at that. But certainly, what she's referring to is a lot of times you'll have birds that during the breeding season they're forest birds, but during the post-fledgling period, after they're young out of the nest, a lot of times they'll move into more of these shrubbery areas because they provide better cover for their young. And so sometimes you'll have forest birds in more shrubby areas. And so she was so I don't know if we can see that in the banding data or not. If it's probably not a rich enough data set to really get into that, but we could certainly look to see if they over time if they pop up later in the season than earlier.
Like the Middle East.
Yeah, but they did show up in as our point counts. They did show up in repeated points in the shrubland. So maybe they don't need closed canopy forest. Maybe the fact that some of the pine barrens, it's not like we're right. Some of the pine barrens still have remaining trees, the pitch pine, but it's a much more open canopy. So there might be enough for some of these birds that prefer forest to sort of hang around, but certainly we're losing things that really like closed canopy forests, like the hermit thrushes and the wood thrushes and the veeries. Those things are definitely dropping out because we still have occasionally scarlet tanagers popping up in the barrens and that kind of stuff. But by and large, they're mostly associated with forest. If there's one thing you can always count on, the birds are like, that's a forest bird. And the next thing you know, it's like you see it out on a grassland, you're like, what's going on? Inevitably that sort of stuff happens. But so you're sort of looking at these overall trends. Yes.
Just curious about that one bird. I forget which one it was that you tracked with the tracker you had to pick up later. You had to go with recapture the bird, which must have been very difficult to do. I was just wondering what your recapture rate was. How many did you put on that you
Yeah, that's a good question. We had surprisingly good luck. We had a few transmitters that we put on and never saw again. But I'd say we probably got 3/4 of them back. Yeah, and it's not, then they get smart, right? You capture them, usually the first time you capture them, they're like, who's this male in my territory? And they fly right into the net. But a lot of times we're like, wait a minute, I remember this. And so a lot of times it's much harder to get them back in the net the second time, which is troublesome because you need to get the device off of them to get the data. And so sometimes it's a lot of extra work to get those, recapture those birds. That's why that bluebird just keeps coming in. We capture him, he knows the game and he just keeps coming in, he keeps giving us data.
Switch back. Transmitted.
Well, those are solar, so those aren't gonna give us any information at night. And those also, the way those work, is they have to be within the node network.
Okay,
And-
so you use the two different kinds for different
Yes, for different purposes, yeah. Because, yeah, they do that, Dylan found, we were like, why aren't we seeing any of these towhees migrating? Well, how come they're not showing up? Because they're migrating down the coast and they weren't being picked up on any of the Modus towers. It's like, well, they're solar tags, and if they're migrating at night, right, you're not gonna pick them up. But mostly they're active during the day, and so when they're in our node network, then they're actively transmitting data. But oh, do we want to do one online? Oh, thank you. I forgot.
I'll leave it.
I mean, yeah, I mean, we want to publish it. We want to publish it first. I'm not sure what their intentions are, if they're noble or not. But you know, we would like to publish on that first. We don't want to get scooped. But yeah, potentially. I mean, or if they're interested in collaborating, then they should reach out to us and see what their wants are for the data. But no, we would want to have first go at it.
Discussion. It says.
What are the effects of the crushing insect populations? Certainly we're worried about them for the whippoorwills, right? Because of butterfly and moth populations are declining precipitously. Just a paper just came out this year that said over the last since 2020 or since 2000 to 2022, butterfly populations had declined across the country about 20%. So that means like 1 in 5, we've lost 1 in 5 butterflies in the last 20 years. And so if you're a specialist on moths like an eastern whippoorwill, then that is probably having some sort of effect on that. And but I don't know about, that was just for butterflies and moths. I'm not sure if we know what's going on with insect populations more broadly. Do we? I have 2 entomologists here. White, tell me what's going on. Yeah, I mean, so, and certainly the populations are down, but I don't know if there's been any studies that have definitely quantified the decline. So have they? There's kind of it's a tricky thing to do. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and that was the case for the butterflies too. I think they said pesticide and habitat loss is always the big one. Pesticide use is another one. But I would expect the birds are declining, the insects are declining. I wouldn't be surprised if they are related. We had a question in the back.
So do you time birds like breeding season right
No, because we're so restricted on when we can burn that we just burn, and the right, we're inevitably we're probably burning up some birds, and that's an unfortunate side effect. But this is what happened historically, right? We gotta maintain the habitat. If we wait, we're only going to be doing dormant season burns, and that's going to give us very different results. And so no, we don't typically time that.
We are.
Yes, thank you.
Birds that.
Yeah, so yeah, and that works for the carners. For the carners are endangered species here too. We don't burn. We don't nuke like a whole area. We'll only do like a third of that, so that there's areas where they can recolonize from.
Does the density of the bird populations increase as you go deeper into the pine barrens? Are they
Oh, that's a good question.
are light and sound from humans as you get closer to the populations? They kind of avoid those areas?
That's a good question. So the question was, are densities higher more in the interior areas than the edges? I don't know. That's a good question. We should like maybe we can look into that. One of the because we have one of the things we can look at is a covariate we can put in the analysis, the distance of those point counts to the edge of the preserve or to human areas, and we can see if that affects abundance. One of the things I expect that we've talked about doing is we're out there trying to count birds, and the throughway runs right through the middle of it. So certainly if that's not affecting the abundance of the bird, that's affecting our ability to detect the birds because it's loud and the birds are there and they're probably singing and we probably can't hear them. And so certainly in terms of our ability to detect the birds, I want to put in distance to say throughway as a covariate because we're expecting that's going to affect our ability to detect them. Is it affecting abundance? I don't know. That's a good question, and we could potentially tease that out if we sort of separate our point counts, our points into ones that are more in the center and ones that are closer to the edge. It's a good question. But certainly some of those whippoorwills, like if you zoom in on some of those things, some of those birds were heading outside the preserve at night, and we're like, "What the heck is that bird doing?" It's like out in a neighborhood. Yeah, it's in people's backyards, and so. So for the whippoorwills anyway, but I don't know, we don't have, but most of the birds we track and we have actually data on are all within the preserve, but the whippoorwills are ones that.
See that my house, one's like front prop.
Okay. Well, places like we were all, yeah. People were, yeah, way underwater.
Do you have any more questions?
Yes.
Is there a way to know how long it takes for a form to find or start using the suitable habitat once it exists?
No, I mean, I don't know, like, it's not like we know that they're out there waiting just like for this area to open up and then they're gonna move in. That's a very tricky question. No, but also we can, I mean, we knew the whippoorwills were here in the area, but they weren't here, and so whether or not how long that took them to register, it's like they might have, from their perspective, they might have said it's available, I'm coming in right away. It might not have been like, oh, it's available, it took them 10 years to find it. Right, these birds, don't forget, they're looking at the landscape at a very different scale than we are. These birds they're literally looking at it from hundreds of feet above, and so they can see the landscape in a very different way. And so I would expect that bird species would arrive here relatively quickly if we are providing suitable habitat, because we think if their populations are hard enough, they have to have source, they have to have this
We had,
propagules. The year after, yeah. Yeah. So my guess is we usually look to the wildlife to tell us what we're doing. And if the wildlife show up, then usually means like you're doing something. Yes. And so if they're not here, then that may mean that we're still not providing something quite right for them. And so my guess is that they would probably show up relatively quickly if we were providing that, because like I said, they're migrating past here. And if it looked good, they very might settle. So it's not like, unless their populations are really restricted, they're probably know that the preserve is here. If I can assign that much autonomy to like the bird, they would find it if we provided them with good habitat.
Steve?
All right, thank you, everybody.